Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 6 by Nathan Brown.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready? The announcer yelled, startling Rogan from his state of hypnagogia. Our ferocious new challenger will be taking on your reigning champions, Hisk with devastating speed and precision and Thyle, the monstrous man of doom. Prepare yourselves for the terrible twins. The crowd screamed and drums started beating. A large spotlight shone on the other side of the arena and Rogan saw two furry, bipedal, cat-like men walking towards the spiked arena. They had long, orangish hair covering their entire bodies, similar to the Wookiee or the Wampa except their fur was straight and well-kept, not shaggy. The hair covering their faces was shorter and completely white. One, he assumed, was Thyle, was almost as tall as he was, and the other, Hisk, was surprisingly small, about half the size. He walked towards the pit and allowed himself to be lowered into it. He waited as the two men walked around the arena, waving to the crowd. Rogan studied the men as he walked, forcing the fogginess from his mind. The small one had two long, curved knives strapped to his back. Even when he was walking casually around the arena, Rogan could see he walked on the balls of his feet and his entire body seemed tensed, coiled like a spring, as if he were prepared for an unexpected attack. The large one carried a long wooden spear tipped with a durasteel spike. His arms were casually at his side and he walked with long, slow, flat-footed strides. Despite their sizes, it was clear the smaller man was the greater threat. Rogan knew he had one advantage. Champions like this never ended up fighting people, and, when they did, they only faced wounded and tired men. As he was called to his feet, he hung his head and hunched his back. Walking straight to the pit as the brothers continued circling around, he kept his sword low as if it were too heavy for him to hold. He would pretend to be more tired than he was until the fight started. The men were lowered into the pit after Rogan, still smiling and waving to the crowd. They looked at him, clearly tired and worn out, with a knowing smile. The smaller one drew his knives and smiled in anticipation. Both of the strange, furry men crouched and held their weapons towards him, as the voice came over the speaker. On fight. Rogan once again shut out the crowd and the announcer. He stared at the smaller cat. He saw nothing there but cold, focused calculation. When he looked at the larger man, he saw something else in face. There was a lack of attention and a somewhat distanced look in his eye. Rogan smiled to himself. The man was clearly drunk. These two hadn't expected to fight today, and the larger man had clearly taken advantage of the free time. Rogan struck quickly before they could coordinate an attack. He feigned a shallow stab towards the smaller one, who jumped back quickly. Immediately he spun backwards, bringing his sword bearing onto the larger man, who reacted surprisingly fast. Despite his inebriated state, he clearly wasn't to be taken lightly. The man planted his spear into the ground and used it to push himself out of the way. Rogan's sword kept coming and it crashed into the man's spear, causing it to splinter in half. He tried to press his advantage, but before he could lift his sword, he felt two quick jabs in his left leg. He whirled his head back around to see the small man smiling, a thin line of blood on both his blades. Rogan swung his sword up and behind him, over his shoulder. The move caught the man off guard and sliced a shallow cut in his furry face as he jumped away, missing his eye by centimeters. Rogan turned around fully as the small man fell to his back. Just as he took a step towards the prostrate man, he felt the large twin coming to attack from behind. He needed to stop turning his back on these men. On instinct, Rogan twisted to the right so that he was standing sideways. He heard the man behind him grunt and saw the broken spear whizzing by his stomach. Clearly surprised by Rogan's dodge, Thyle had overextended and now wasn't in a position to pull himself back fast enough. Rogan punished his mistake and lashed out with his elbow, smashing the Cathar in the face. Thyle dropped his spear and his hands flew up to his nose. He hurriedly backpedaled away from Rogan, blood running through his fingers. Knowing their tactics, Rogan turned on the small man before he could attack him from behind. He grabbed his sword with both hands and thrust it down on the man, who was on his knees trying to stand. The Cathar quickly got one foot under him and brought his knives up in an X, catching Rajan's sword in the middle and pushing it up so it passed harmlessly above his head. The massive sword slid along the crevice, sending up a shower of sparks as the Cathar worked to keep it away from him. Rogan pressed down, surprised by the small man's strength. There was a kick at the back of his legs and Rogan collapsed to his knees. His RMS flew up and his sword fell to the sand as he did. The big man brought his spear up horizontally under Rajan's chin and pulled it, forcing him painfully back to his feet. Rogan attempted to force his chin down to his chest and, when that didn't help, he tried in vain to tear the spear from his throat. The small man stood slowly, raising his arms to the crowd, calling out his victory. He sauntered over to the far side of the pit, wiping his face and looking distastefully at the blood. He held up a blade to the crowd and then played with it for a moment, drawing out the suspense. Rogan struggled to suck in air as he fought against the man's spear. Hisk cocked his arm back to throw the knife, giving Rogan a wink. He saw it all in slow motion as the Cathar took a deep step forward and brought his arm down for the throw. Once the fingers released the hilt and the knife was almost out of his hands, Rogan moved. He lashed out with his tail, whipping it up to slam into at the large man's crotch. The man let out a yelp of pain and released his grip on the spear. Ducking down quickly, Rogan felt the knife whiz over his head and thud into the Cathar's chest, cutting off his long groan. Still crouched low to the ground, Rogan grabbed the broken spear from and shoved it backwards, driving it into the man's stomach, just to be sure. Rogan looked up in time to see the look on the remaining twin's face turn from pain and surprise to anger. Had he not been so focused on the fight, he half laughed in the face of this cocky man, showboating around before the fight was even won, letting his opponent formulate a plan instead of finishing him quickly. The tiny fool deserved death. Rogan picked up his sword and ran at the man, bringing his blade low to hack at his opponent's legs. The Cathar jumped sideways over the blade, landing in a roll and coming up behind Rogan, stabbing him quickly in the leg before diving away. "So big, so slow," he said as he took his other knife from his brother's chest. The man was clearly much faster than Rogan. At the same time, he had made the mistake many outsiders make of assuming that all Barabels were simply dumb brutes because of their appearance. Rogan feigned a slice from the right end. When the man stepped back to avoid it, he lunged forward and aimed a kick at the man's chest. Hisk tried to move out of the way, but Rajan's foot still caught him in the shoulder, making him spin around and fall face first into the sand. He managed to turn it into a clumsy roll away from Rogan, coming to his feet centimeters from the spikes. "Not so slow after all," the Cathar panted with a smile. Rogan ignored his foolishness, sprinting with his sword pointed forward like a lance. He held it low, aiming to run the tiny man through. The small man ducked under the blade, jumping down to lie flat on his stomach. Rajan's sword retraced its steps, coming back before stabbing down. Hisk turned onto his back and the sword that sunk useless slid to the sand beside him. From his back, the man reached up and stabbed Rogan in the thigh with both knives, twisting his blades roughly before yanking them back out. The pain of the vicious attack flashed in Rajan's head and caused his leg to give out and to drop him once again to his knees. The Cathar stood and slashed at Rajan's chest while moving away. The blades stung as they skipped off his scales, but didn't draw any blood. Rogan buried his pain and stepped up on his unsteady leg. He dropped his sword and stared at the slight man as he casually backed away. Rogan was tired of dealing with this squirming, cowardly man. He no doubt thought himself to be a great warrior as he darted around like a pathetic swamp rat, stabbing Rogan in the back and striking him while he was distracted. On Barab 1, a warrior would die rather than shame himself in such a way. Clearly it was not the same in the rest of the galaxy. Rajan's anger grew and he stood with his arms relaxed, waiting for the man to attack him. The Cather tilted his head in confusion before running at Rogan. He swiped with his right knife towards Rajan's side. Rogan let himself be hit, accepting the painful but unthreatening cut. Before the slimy man could back away, Rogan grabbed at his extended arm and pinned it to his side. He ignored the pain as the knife, still embedded in his side, moved about, pulled by the struggling, panicking Cathar. He pulled his right arm back and smashed the man in the face, crushing it under his rock-hard fist. His face erupted with blood and he cried out in agony, stabbing Rogan in the shoulder with his free blade. The thin tip slipped through Rajan's scales and drove into his flesh, but Rogan ignored the pain. Rather than give up, he used the pain to fuel his next strike, practically forcing his way through the man's wet, matted face. He brought his knee up into the Cathar's ribs. Feeling the ribs shatter, he released the man and let him flop to his knees, doubled over from the hard impact. Rogan tried to uppercut the folded, practically unconscious man. As he swung his arm up, the man amazingly bent back, straightening himself just in time for Rajan's fist to fly past, centimeters away from connecting. The amazingly present man swiveled to the left and stabbed at Rajan's thigh, drawing blood once again. Roaring with anger, at himself and at his enemy, Rogan reached down and tried to grab at him, images of crushing the smaller man filling his mind. As he should have expected, Hisk easily ducked out of the way. He swiped at Rajan's ribs as he stood. The sword scratched painfully against his side again and left a chalky white mark on his scales. Rogan reached again for the Cathar with his clawed hand, but he jumped out of the way and scrambled to the other side of the pit. Hisk stood there as Rogan heaved with weariness and anger, a smile barely visible past his bloody mess of a face. How had Rogan been so foolish? He had done exactly what this fool-ish cat had done. He'd released the man when he thought he was finished, giving him a chance to recover. He had been so certain he'd felt bones break. Now the man stood, crouched and ready, as if he had never been hurt. "Not so slow, but not fast enough," he said with a smile. Rogan looked at the man, searching for anger or fear he could use to strengthen himself, but he found nothing. Even after all he had done to the man, even causing him to kill his own brother, there was no emotion. The man was cold and calculated, fighting with his mind instead of his emotions. Rogan was draining blood, the strength slowly seeping out of him. If he could just grab the man he could crush him, but he knew the small man was too fast for him. He'd lost his only chance. The Cathar just stood there, taunting him with his stillness, making no move to attack. The contempt and arrogance of the worm stirred anger up within Rogan. Instead of ignoring the anger and trying to stay focused as he usually did, he embraced it. He found the fury and concentrated on it, feeding it and letting it grow slowly. As it grew into a brewing flame, he used it to fuel himself and give him strength. He felt his weariness falling away and he felt something besides anger rise up in him. It was feeding off the rage, building and pushing to be released. The Cathar's smug face fell away as he felt something changed within the pit. He ran towards Rogan, confusion and worry mixing on his face. When he got within a meter of him, Rogan emitted a yell and stretched his hands towards the man. The running man froze immediately as if he had run into an invisible wall. He stood completely still, held by the unseen force. Rogan continued to yell as he released his rage, holding the struggling Cathar in place. His mouth opened in a silent scream of pain. Rogan raised his arms and the man lifted off his feet, suspended in the air, his face contorting in pain. Rogan continued pressing in on the man with the force, crushing him with it, and still the man didn't scream. He let loose one final roar, scratchy and raw because of his overworn throat. The scream was carried forward on a wave of invisible force that collapsed into the man. Rogan immediately felt the man expire and he let him drop to the ground. The yelling in his stream of force energy cut off at the same time. When he closed it off, he could still feel the rage-fueled fire within him simmering on low, ready to be fanned into a full flame. After using the force, he felt drained and tired, but this time, Rogan felt strong and hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every sense was overactive. He felt the sharp pain from his cuts and scrapes, the arid, sandy air blowing against them and making them sting. He could hear the soft murmur of the astonished crowd and the quiet static coming through the still speakers. He could smell blood, his and that of his defeated foes. His mouth was thick with the sharp, coppery taste of blood mixed with saliva. Both had dried to a thick gel-like state. He took all of this in at once, feeling and processing it all in a split second. He raised his arms in the air and roared at the top of his lungs. His yell broke the crowd's stunned silence and they erupted, joining in with his call. Scene change. Cognews sat in silence as the hysterical crowd frothed around her. She had seen the exact scene in her vision a few days ago, yet still she was amazed. It was different to see it like a video as opposed to witnessing it in person, to feel him change from gathering the emotions from others to concentrating on himself to fuel his powers. She wondered if he had even understood the shift. While not unheard of, it was rare for an untrained being to show such command over the force. She watched patiently as men were lowered into the pit to bring the barbell out. "I promised you a brilliant battle and I dare say I delivered," screamed the voice over the speakers. "We're gonna get him cleaned up and then we'll bring your new champion out for a proper introduction." The men guided the barbell to the tunnel through which the two Cathars had entered the arena. Cognews pushed her way through the screaming crowd until she was in the row just above the tunnel. She strengthened her aura of perception and jumped quickly down the almost 10 meters to the sand of the arena, cushioning the fall with the force and causing a small cloud of sand to fly up. As soon as she landed on the sand, she used the force to quickly dash into the tunnel before the excited crowd could see her. Scene change. Rogan was laid out on a long table in a room within the tunnel as dozens of hands flew over him, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds, cleaning and filing his dirty, chipped scales. Someone came with some sort of paste and made a move to put it on his chest. "No," Rogan insisted, holding his hand over the scar. "It will get rid of the scar," the man replied in a quiet, nervous voice, still trying to spread the paste on him. "I want it to stay," he insisted firmly. The man nodded and quickly walked away. The short, dark-skinned man who had led them into the arena walked into the room in the tunnel. He had a greedy smile that took over his entire face. He pushed the attendant out of the way until he came up beside Rajan's table. "I say, give 'em a show to all the fighters I handle, but I've never had someone take it to heart like you. That was absolutely astounding. Best STR-ing of fights I think I've ever had the pleasure of seeing." He paused his gushing to catch his breath and turned to see another man entering before he could continue. "Champion, let me introduce you to my father, Ahif Balu, the proprietor of the Alcaro Gladiator Pits." Rogan sat up and saw a tall, older man walking towards them. He had a full head of white hair and a matching beard. The stark white made his skin seem even darker. He walked towards them in long, steady strides, his beaming face mirroring his son's. Before he got up to the table, he dismissed the bumbling attendant trying to work around the younger man. They quickly and happily filed out of the room, leaving Rogan alone with these two men and their overly happy faces. Well, he said, grabbing Rajan's hand and pumping it enthusiastically. "That was quite a fight, simply magnificent, and then the surprise ending. Any other fighter would have used it in every fight, but not you, my man. You're a true showman. And, he leaned in as if he had an important secret to tell. Not many are privy to this information, but my ancestors were from Harun Kal. They were Koran. So I know a thing or two about the Force. Not close to your level of mastery, of course, he added quickly. Rogan just nodded and plastered a fake smile on his face as the man droned on. He had no idea what a Koran was or what that should mean to him. Eventually, the man's never-ending chatter wore him thin. He had things to do and they couldn't be done from here. So when am I going to leave? Rogan asked, interrupting the man's stream of conversation. He and his son looked at each other quickly. Well, don't you worry about that yet, champion, he chuckled awkwardly. Hey, it's not right that we just keep calling you champion. What's your name, son? Rogan felt fierce greeting from the man and he knew he was trying to cover something up. He stood up from the table and towered over the man threateningly. He was about to ask for the truth when he felt something enter the room. The presence was so overwhelming it cleared his mind and made him forget what he was about to say or why he was upset. He looked towards the door and saw a small, thin man in a loose black robe with a large hood pulled down over his face. As he looked over to the man and felt the spirit radiating from him, he knew it was someone like him. It reminded him somewhat of the essence he had felt radiating off the Jedi, but it still felt different. Instead of the sickly sweetness that made bile rise in his stomach, there was a strong, hard aura that made him feel more potent just by being around it. The older man looked around strangely and Rogan knew he could feel it as well. The younger man had fallen silent but made no other sign that he knew what was going on. The mysterious man reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out two long metal rods. With a dual snap hiss, two short blue blades materialized from the rods he and Ao saw were lightsaber hilts. It was the same weapon the Jedi had used to cut through his sword, except that, for some reason, the blades were much shorter and the hilts were almost twice as long. The men turned around and pulled blaster pistols from their holster quickly and shot at the intruder. The hooded man flourished his blades wildly and the bolts flew backwards towards the men, burning holes into their chests. They fell stiffly to the ground. "Follow me," he whispered harshly from beneath the hood. Moving quickly, he walked past Rogan, away from the arena and deeper into the tunnel. He walked without looking back, extinguished his lightsabers and placing them back in his robes. Either he knew Rogan would follow or didn't care. Without a moment of hesitation, Rogan quickly turned and followed after him, his longer strides helping him to easily catch up with the smaller man. They walked deeper into the tunnel until it opened to a large room. It had two chairs in the middle of the room and a table littered with food and drinks. Rogan assumed this was where the two Cathars had waited before the fight. Besides the table, there were two staircases in the room, one going up and one heading down. The man stood still in the middle of the room and bowed his head for a moment of pause. Rogan was about to ask where they were going when the robed man started moving again, quickly going up the stairs. They walked up 3 flights of stairs before going through a large wooden door and emerging outside. The man continued walking through the busy street and Rogan followed after him. He started to fall behind as the people surrounding him stopped walking and stared up at his massive frame in awe, forcing him to push his way through. He tried to ignore their stares as he picked up his pace and continued after the man who was able to move quickly, using his smaller frame to knife through the crowd. Rogan started to recognize his surroundings and he realized they were heading towards the spaceport. After a few more minutes, they came to the docks and the man walked up to a large black ship. He reached into his robe and the door in the side of the ship opened with a hiss. Once again, without looking back, the man entered the ship. Once again, Rogan followed him without hesitation. The mysterious man closed the door and turned around, pulling his hood down at the same time. As the hood came down, Rogan was surprised to see a woman's face exposed. She had pale, red skin and a beautiful face that was covered with thick black tattoos, somewhat similar to the Zabraks. Protruding from her temples, she had two large, cone-shaped horns. They were light brown and they curved downward, ending in a point on either side of her chin. Seeing his clear surprise, a mischievous grin appeared on her face and two set of small, pointed teeth were exposed. The hands she had used to pull down the hood, which were now hidden by the long arms of her robe, were disproportionately large for a female of her size. Rogan didn't recognize the species of the woman, but, living on an isolated planet like Barab-1, he didn't have knowledge of many species. Not knowing her species, Rogan also couldn't estimate her age, but she had the agility and stance of a young person. Stretched to her full height, she only reached his chest, but the commanding presence emanating from her made Rogan feel dwarfed for the first time in his life. "I am Darth Cognus, heir to the line of Bane and Loss, T of the Dark Lords of the Sith." Rogan didn't know what to say in response. This was beyond his wildest dreams, yet he had so many questions. How did she find him? How did she survive when all others had fallen to the Jedi? What did she expect of him now? What is the line of Bane? Rogan asked finally. Her playful smile disappeared and her face became quickly serious. "That is for my apprentice to learn, and you are not yet my apprentice. First you must prove yourself to be worthy." "Weren't you watching when I defeated those 6 men?" Rogan asked, slightly insulted. "Isn't that proof enough?" "I was watching and I was very impressed," she replied calmly. "However, there is more to being a Sith than just martial strength. There is wisdom, patience, cunning, desire, forethought, and, most importantly, there is sacrifice. You have proven your physical prowess, but, until you prove yourself in the rest, you are unworthy to be named my apprentice." Rogan nodded, believing it would be more prudent to stay silent than to ask one of the many questions quickly filling his mind. "Can you fly a ship?" Darth Cognus asked him. "No," Rogan replied, resisting the urge to explain why. This woman didn't seem like one who would enjoy excuses. Well then, sit in the co-pilot's chair. I will fly today and you will fly from here on out. I hope you're a quick learner." Rogan nodded again, remaining calm on the outside when in truth he was extremely nervous. This was only the second time he had been on a ship, and the first time he had seen a cockpit. The blinking lights and seemingly endless buttons meant nothing to him. He waited until Darth Cognus sat down and then sat in the chair behind her. As soon as he sat down in the soft chair, his weariness fell over him. He tried to brush it away, but it was like a heavy blanket smothering him that refused to be shaken off. "Use the Force and your emotions to purge yourself of distractions," Darth Cognus told him as she stared down at the dashboard. Rogan didn't truly know how to do that. He'd only used the Force in combat situations to increase his physical prowess. Using it to increase his mental focus was foreign to him. No matter his inexperience with the technique, he knew he had to try. He closed his eyes for a moment and searched his past for a memory with strong emotions attached to it. The day he got his scar flashed into his mind and he latched onto it. The anger and sadness, the bitterness and pain. The emotions rolled through him, burning his fatigue away, making him feel hyper-aware of his surroundings again. He tried to control it, and focus in on Darth Cognus' motions. He managed to rein it in and was able to slow down and analyze her actions as she did them. He was amazed at the specific control over his emotions. He thought that being in the presence of Darth Cognus made him stronger. Scene change. Cognus smiled to herself at the ease with which the Barabel conjured his emotions to focus. She acted as if he may not become her apprentice, but she knew the Force had a reason for bringing them together. She was surprised by the strength of the emotions he had brought up. She would have to ask him the story behind those feelings later. Scene change. I can pass, Kinza told the security officer guarding the crime scene, using the force to cloud the man's judgment and persuade him. You can pass, ma'am, the man said as he stepped aside to let Kinza through. This was the second time in a week she had used the force to bend a civilian's will, and this security officer was certainly an innocent. She justified it to herself because it would have taken hours of explaining for her to get in without doing it. She walked down the long tunnel, trying to stay in the shadows away from the officers. The tunnel opened into a large room packed with people. Luckily, none of them were looking her way. They were all focused on the bodies in the middle of the room. They were both bald, dark-skinned humans. They looked so similar Kinza assumed they were related. Based on age, Kinza figured father and son. On the edge of the onlookers, she saw two other brown-skinned humans that she figured were other relatives of the deceased. The dead men had pistol blasters in their hands and blaster burns through the middle of both their chests. Kinza stood just outside the ring of people and studied the scene, trying to retroactively figure out how it had all unfolded. She ran through different possibilities, picturing it all in her head, but couldn't get it to make sense. The main problem was how had Rogan obtained a gun. As much as she understood it, these gladiator battles used strictly melee weapons. She had thought of him stealing one of their guns and then shooting them, but then why would he have bothered to place it back in their hands? She felt a nagging feeling that something more was involved here, that there was more here than what she could see, something darker. Whether that feeling was all in her head or it was real, she had hit a dead end here. She would collect all the information she could and then return to Coruscant. As much as she hated needing help, it was clear she needed it here. She would take it before the Masters and see what they could make of it.